Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Catholic ReCon Testimonies from Reverts and Converts. I'm your host, Eddie Trask. Please subscribe and make sure you share this channel as much as you can so that more people can hear Catholic stories. This week's guest is Edmund Weiner, who is visiting here from good old Oxford in England. And it is a privilege here. We're not going to talk about what time it is for me or for Edmund, but rest assured, we did our best to come together. So, welcome, Edmund, to the program.
That's a great pleasure.
So let's get right into it. And I know there are many chapters to this story, and I think if we were to title this, it has to do with what did you say in your email? I think it said 72 years to
That's
become.
what yes.
It took 72 years, but let's go to the beginning, where you would like to pick up.
Okay, well, I was born here in Oxford back in 1950. And as far as faith or religion goes, there wasn't much in my home. My mother was, I suppose, culturally a member of the Church of England, but by the time she married my dad, I think it was just the sort of the moral framework, really, she didn't have any she didn't worship, she didn't have any interest in theology. And my dad, he was a university teacher and a research scientist. He was actually born Jewish. Um, but when he met my mother, he had pretty much abandoned his faith. And for most of his life, he was a scientific humanist. But I actually remained totally ignorant that he was Jewish until I was an adult. I had no idea. I didn't know anything about that background or that heritage, sadly. Um, Oddly enough, when I was already about one and my sister was about six, something impelled my mum to get us baptized in Church of England. Maybe she had a little sort of revival of belief. I don't know. Anyway, moving on a bit, I probably um, gained most of my Christian beliefs at a sort of my independent, what we call a preparatory school in England. I was about between 7 and 12. It wasn't a religious school, wasn't denominational, didn't have a chapel, but in those days, it was pretty normal to have daily prayers and scripture lessons, and I was quite happy with all that. I loved singing the hymns. I suppose I had a sort of romantic imagination, but mystical. I like those sort of things, and it all appealed to me. That we didn't have any sort of pressure to believe. It wasn't evangelism. It was just faith was just taken for granted, really. Um, and I guess the sort of simple kind of Christian faith that we were taught really stressed the sort of the ethics, the morals of Christianity, kind of being a decent person, that kind of thing. And I mean, I guess it was basically, Anglican, but we weren't really taught a lot about the ins and outs of theology. Um, it stressed, tolerance and respect for other beliefs. So in its own way, it was a good form of faith, even though it didn't provide you with the sort of the deeper, the what we really need. Um, and I was quite interested in scripture as well, and I remember when I was about 10, I got a copy of the New English Bible translation. We were all very excited because there was a new translation of the Bible, the New Testament. Um, and I guess it might be worth saying a little bit more about this sort of cultural milieu here, because I think it's a bit different from America in the 1950s. Um, Especially in a place like Oxford, which is quite an educated, sophisticated kind of city. Um, it was in some ways pretty secular, but to some extent, it was because people with faith were quite tolerant, quite accepting of other of differences. Um, but there was still quite strong loyalty to the church back then. And this was before the culture of the 1960s began to bite. And within the Church of England, there was quite a spectrum of beliefs. There was the Anglo-Catholicism, there was evangelicalism, there was liberalism. And I suppose what I learned was somewhere in, it was sort of liberal, but not in the sense that's used today to mean having very few beliefs. Most groups in those days would have been pretty united in what they thought, what they believed morally. We hadn't got the sort of the hit of the all the problems about sexual and gender and the reproductive issues. It was a bit simpler then, really. Um, so as I say, the prevailing flavor really was emphasis on good moral standards, love of one's neighbor, that kind of thing. Um, and uh, in my own context, I mean, I wasn't really in a situation as I grew up as a teenager with a lot of you know parties and sort of heavy you know sort of drugs and drink and that sort of thing. I was in a pretty sort of safe environment really. So those kind of things didn't really impinge on me very much. I suppose I was a little bit of a nerd really. Um, um, and um, and anyway, by the time these things really would have come along, I think my heart had already been captured by the faith.
Wow.
So uh, so moving on to teenage time, my mum used to give me ideas on what books to read. And when I was about 13 or 14, she suggested I should read stories by G.K. Chesterton. There was a strange suggestion because she was pretty anti-Catholic. For some reason, she was very, very anti-Catholic. But I didn't particularly imbibe those views of hers because, there was Catholic boys at my school. They were normal human beings. Anyway, so I started reading Chesterton's fiction, um, which was great. And I was planning to study English, so I read his sort of literary studies, which are also very good, and became an ardent admirer, and then stumbled on his religious writings, and I thought those really captivating. I suppose if I had felt, that to be like him, one ought to be Catholic, that would have been a complete impossibility at that stage. It would be sort of like changing one's, I don't know, nationality or something. And not to mention my mother's views. But anyway, while I was reading his book Orthodoxy in about February 1965, I consciously tried to make a new Christian start in life. I really felt, I needed to. I don't know where this all came, how it happened. I wasn't talking to other people about it. And and I guess at this stage I really wanted to know or at least not to know, but to have the conviction that God exists and the Christian faith was really true. Because, you know, culture around me was pretty secular, although I did go to an independent secondary school, what we call public school, where which was Church of England foundation. We had morning prayer every day, which I liked, and I guess most people probably thought was, didn't believe in, didn't accept. Um, anyway, as I say, I was a bit of a sort of studious person, bit of a nerdy person, and I, exploring my local public library, I started reading some Christian apologetics books, and in the course of this, I came across C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. That book struck me like it was really like lightning from heaven. It really was. I just read it over and over and over, and I became convinced that Christ was true, the life he offered was one could be wonderful, and I had to follow him. And I think one of the things that really chimed with me was Lewis's belief in joy. He talked a lot about joy, and it was exactly what I experienced. Um, listening to certain kinds of music or going, a beautiful day, that kind of thing. That feeling of you know, transcendental is sort of a bit of a
Yes.
complicated word, but a kind of going completely outside yourself. And that just seemed to me to be an insight. So I then voraciously read everything else that Lewis wrote and became even more devoted to him than I had been to Chesterton. So, of course, the next thing was, despite being in this quite secular family, I was about 16, I plucked up the courage to get confirmed at school and in the Church of England with my mother's support, which was great. And I started attending a church, Anglican church. And again, my mother actually came along too. And I guess even a mother who isn't really committed to the faith, God's grace can work through her love, which is something really, because my mother wasn't necessarily the easiest person to get on with a lot of the time, but I owe this to her, which is great. So I suppose now I'm a teenager who's really concerned to live the Christian life, which is not so common. Um, and I really studied the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels. I was very serious about it. And I went in for a lot of prayer and a lot of self-examination. And I discovered an intriguing but rather troubling thing. You've got to obey Christ, but it's also pretty impossible by nature. The harder you tried, the more you seemed to fail, or at least the more aware you became of how you just couldn't live up to his standards. And I actually became quite depressed about, feeling that I was not a good person. And so I began to really search for some secret of the Christian life that would really make it work. So in a sense, I suppose you could say I hadn't quite got that close to Jesus, even though I knew he was the most important person. Um, Something wasn't quite working. Anyway, so I think I mentioned my leanings towards the sort of the mystical, and I always loved myths and legends, and was always attracted to the medieval era. And so I have to say that before this, about age 12, at school I read the Lord of the Rings. So we have the trio now,
Yeah.
Chesterton, Lewis, and Tolkien. And actually reading the Lord of the Rings at the age of 12 set the course for the whole of my life and my career as a language professional. I just loved everything that stood for. And so, as a teenager, I increasingly came to enjoy reading medieval English literature, including that of the Anglo-Saxon period. And this is what I studied as a student at Oxford. So it meant, of course, that I became very familiar with medieval Catholicism. So even when I was quite a fervent evangelical, which we'll get to, I could never really dismiss the faith of this era. There's such beautiful poems. There's one called Pearl, which expresses the most amazing devotion to our Lord. And later on, as a postgraduate, I worked on the writings uh, of medieval Christians, actually heretical Christians, but uh, don't need to go into that really.
Hmm.
So, so even while I was feeling a bit depressed about my finding it difficult to be a good Christian, what happened was that evangelicalism came into my life, and it stayed there for 23 years. It started when a curate at my church, well, I was now living in London actually, but he gave me an evangelical pamphlet called Sacrifice, and I found it frankly frightening. It seemed to say that God demanded one's everything immediately. And of course, Lewis said that, but
Yep.
he said it in a kind of inspirational way, in a sort of joyful way. And this felt rather bleak, rather uninspiring in a way, but it seemed to occupy even higher moral ground. I can't explain this, but it seemed to have these. It was stern. And I was convinced that I couldn't ignore this. So I was sort of rather miserably grappling with, you know, kind of an absolutist feeling about faith. Anyway, at that moment, I encountered my first live evangelical Christians. I was at a student meeting just before I went to university, and two of the participants stood up and gave their testimonies to Christ. And I was impressed, but also a bit frightened by this boldness. I hadn't experienced this kind of, people speaking like this about their beliefs. So I had a word with them, and the outcome was that they took me along to an evangelical meeting in a private house near my home. And this meeting was amazing. It was crowded with people, all ages and classes, and some were being taught or shown how to give their lives to Christ. It seemed like, it was a bit like the Book of Acts, all those people sort of getting converted. Um, and then there was extempore prayer. And I'd never experienced extempore prayer. I'd only experienced, well, my own prayers, I suppose, were extempore, but they were private. And otherwise, it was like set prayers in church. And then, even more terrifying, people began praying in tongues. So this was my first encounter, not only with evangelicals, but also with, baptism in the Holy Spirit and all that goes with it. And frightening as it was hard not to think, is this the way? This is the way to make faith work. Anyway, I went to university and I kept away from the charismatics for a bit, but I couldn't really escape from the evangelicals. And in my third term, I joined the Christian Union. That's the evangelical organization in English British universities. I had I had a kind of conversion experience. I prayed a prayer of commitment to Christ. Um, my conversion verse, actually, if you'd like to know, was 1 John 5:3. This is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. And I thought, well, if God says they're not burdensome, then I'm going to be able to do it. So I then became quite a zealous evangelical Christian, took it very seriously, read the Bible assiduously, morning Bible, quiet time, the sort of expression, morning quiet time, 7 o'clock in the morning. um, and one thing I will say, it was a very valuable foundation to really study the Bible, read it.
May I ask how your
Yeah,
family felt about that phase of the
that's a
journey?
very good question. I think that um, I didn't handle that very well. I mean, I didn't do any, I wasn't very good at going out and sort of expressing my faith to them in full. So I didn't try to evangelize them. I think they knew that something had changed. They knew I was involved in this, very deeply involved. And I think they were a bit bothered actually, because I
Oh,
think they felt this form of religion was a bit extreme.
got it.
But I think actually, and this relates to things that we're coming to, I didn't explain it enough. And I think that was not good. Um, so I think there were a kind of slight nervousness on their part. Um, so yeah, I would say that yeah, this conversion, if that's what it was, I think one goes through many conversions. I think my concern was, as I say, to the need to actually live the holy life that God wanted us to live, rather than um, you know, I didn't think I had a sense of having offended God exactly. I don't think that was the thing. I think it was more just the feeling that I wasn't able to do it, to live it. So even then, I kept feeling that there was this power missing from my life, and I often wondered whether the answer lay in, the charismatic experience. Anyway, moving on again. Because of my beliefs, I believed that you couldn't make any big life choice without becoming quite certain that it was God's will, usually by way of a process of, prayer and discernment and lots of and advice. And anyway, so just after graduating, I took part briefly in an outreach mission to overseas students. And during this time, I met a Christian girl whom I really liked. And we stayed in touch, and the friendship developed into a romance. But then I was attacked by terrible scruples. I thought I haven't properly checked that this relationship is God's will. He might have other plans for my life. He might want me to give Claire up. I didn't want to do that. I imbibed a pretty severe image of God, and the idea that God's grace might work through your inclinations was completely foreign to me. I tended to think that he'd probably work against your inclinations. So on top of that, my parents, and especially my mother, took a violent antipathy to Claire. It was awful. I was really devastated by this, by their opposition. It was heartbreaking. And of course, I couldn't make out whether this was a sort of a sign from God that I had made the wrong decision or was simply an attack by the devil. And I had months of sort of mental distress, really. And of course, Claire suffered a lot from my scruples as well as from my family's opposition. She was very tenacious. She wouldn't get back down, despite it being so difficult. And in the end, we did get engaged, and well, this provoked an even worse reaction from my family. They said much too young, and what were her motives, and all kinds of really unpleasant things. It was really devastating because I'd never really experienced, you know, opposition from my parents. They'd always been very supportive. They obviously thought there was something terribly wrong, and I think the religious element was part of it. So as a romance, it was actually wrecked. And when we got married, it didn't, it was a bit muted. It wasn't quite the happy occasion it could have been. Anyway, we got married, we got involved in church life, and true to our evangelical training, we participated in Christian groups, and we even started some, and um, sort of patched up relations with the family, but there wasn't very great warmth between them and Claire. But I will say the one great thing in our marriage, with all the ups and downs, was we had a shared faith in Jesus. We prayed, we read scripture together from the start. So however bad things got, Christ remained the foundation. Um, so, life was a bit up and down. Um, we I suppose because it was perhaps the sort of the spirit of the time, that we had a great aspiration towards a more sort of a community life among Christians. We're always hoping that in church we would be more sort of involved and more more close to each other. That was one thing we really looked for. And we we often felt that, the life of our Anglican church, even though it was evangelical, was a bit sort of, it was a bit humdrum, wasn't very joyful and exciting. Anyway, in 1977 we had our first son, and in 1981 we had twins, boy and a girl. And so from then on, we had all the ups and downs of family life. I actually became quite depressed around the early 1980s. It was really hard having twins and looking after them. My father died in 1982. That was also a sad thing. So I was always looking for, as I keep saying, really, that something would make Christian life powerful and vibrant. And I wanted to have more peace and joy. So I had this sort of, periods of like lowness, and then renewed fervor every time I discovered something that I thought would give more freshness to my faith. Anyway, long story short, because I think a lot really because of this kind of this tendency of mine, this sort of constant looking for the answer. In about 1990, we got involved with a charismatic group, and this group seceded from our church. It didn't become a sort of a splinter church, but it used to meet very regularly for prayer and for teaching. Used to come to our home in the evening, and we'd have meetings that went on quite late. It was a very comforting, very close-knit community, and it exercised, gifts of the Spirit, as they were called, but in a slightly idiosyncratic way. The leaders had practiced a form of prayer counseling, which involved listening to God and through, or as they said, as they thought of it, and people would receive pictures in their minds, and they'd even hear tunes or songs, and these were kind of giving them guidance. Every decision was subjected to hours of prayer, sometimes even overnight, sometimes on the telephone. And as I say, there were these pictures, these tunes, and there was, in fact, quite strong group control. Um, and Claire, I have to say, was always a little bit skeptical of this group's ideas, but I really brainwashed myself into their beliefs and practices. I thought I'd found the answer to, you know, my problems, but I hadn't. And after a year, we became quite disillusioned by certain things that the group did that were wrong. And with a bit of trouble, we separated from them. But for me, the whole experience was really disillusioned me with this kind of form of faith. I really couldn't go on, you know, it was like an aversion therapy. Uh, Obviously, since then I've forgiven and become much more understanding, but I think there's a strand in at least in this country in this form of evangelical which is quite harmful or can be quite harmful.
If you
So
don't mind,
Claire came.
Edmund, if you don't mind me asking, harmful in what respect? What were you seeing?
Um,
Just maybe one or two examples of that.
I think a tendency um, to think that there's a tendency for those who are more in a leadership position, and of course that often means lay people, not people who've been duly appointed and selected and trained, to exercise control over the spiritual lives over other people, sometimes
Mm.
quite subtly and sometimes quite straightforwardly. And it can mean coercion, persuasion, and and not. It doesn't necessarily mean that that the Lord's at work in it. It's kind of it can be very much a human
Sure.
idea. Um, I mean, I could talk more about it, but I think that there's quite a lot of this, and there's quite a lot of um, I think exploitation of people's natural weaknesses, maybe, so that you often have a situation where there are those who are more powerful and those who are regarded as needy spiritually.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
No, that's so helpful. Thank you for elaborating.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we come out of this group. Claire actually was just happy, and she was pretty carried on pretty straightforwardly. She actually went to an evangelical church, but a very non-charismatic one, a very sort of quiet one. Um, but my faith was really battered. For about 5 years, I could only really manage to go to our local Church of England, which was sort of Anglo-Catholic. It was our parish church. And I just went to the early morning communion services, very quiet, no sermons, couldn't face them, no hymns, couldn't face them either. And this period, the 1990s, early 1990s, it was a bit of a secular time in our family's life. And I'm sad to say our teenage children, as they then were really slipped away from church involvement. We hadn't taught them enough about faith for them to grasp how crucial it was. And the church we had been going to, the evangelical church, didn't really catechize them. It was, I think that they went to Sunday school, but I think I spent a lot of time, it was sort of making little sheep and learning, rather simplistic stories, but not. It didn't really, I don't think, prepare them for a more adult faith. Anyway, I take responsibility that we didn't. I mean, I have to say, our children who are now, 40-year-old people are very upright people. They're not, they're, you know, they don't practice faith, but they are people who live a moral life. Um, anyway, moving quickly on again. By the end of the 1990s, we both settled into this parish church, which is Anglo-Catholic church. We stayed there for about 20 years, and we enjoyed the liturgy. Um, I think we still longed for more community. We still longed for deeper commitment, being in a group of more committed fellow Christians, um, didn't really succeed in achieving that. It was as if um, I don't know, people didn't want to go too deep. So it was a paradox because we'd valued the evangelical emphasis on, involvement, on commitment, on, going somewhere with your faith. We just didn't really we didn't go for the tenets. Um, and I think, in fact, the, I would say my own quite intensive study of scripture showed me where an evangelical interpretation wasn't really right. I mean, I don't think I ever really believed in sola scriptura. I didn't really believe in sola fide. I've always loved the letter of James, so that was, you know.
Yeah.
Um, what I think we achieved, what we came to was a sort of inclusive outlook. We sort of had this idea that all all Christians belonged in some way to a sort of mystical church, an invisible church. All churches had something wrong with them. All churches had something right with them. And so it was a kind of, a sort of, um, it was a sort of, I don't know what to call it, a rather holistic belief in all Christians belonging together, but there wasn't a visible unity.
Mm.
Um, anyway, but also, even though this was going on, our um, our marriage was going through quite a difficult time in this period. I think we both had unresolved issues, and we had the pressures of our younger children reaching the end of their school careers, and teenage things, and growing up things and decisions. Um, and I really was not in a good place in many ways. And I have to say that around 2001, we were in such a difficult position with each other. We seriously considered getting divorced. It was a really difficult place to be in. I mean, I won't go into all the reasons for it, but it was a hard time. And for me, it was only because I went into some therapy that I began to sort myself out. Anyway, we didn't get divorced, and we made some what seemed quite small changes. But I don't know, I think the grace of God just saved us from this disaster. Um, and I have to say also, our feelings about each other around this time were compromised by the fact that we both were very close to somebody other than our spouse. We were quite emotionally involved with another person. There, there was no adultery, there was no physical intimacy, nothing like that, but it was just very close friendship. In the end, these relationships ended. It was quite painful, and obviously they were acknowledged and we were talked about, and we understood what we'd been through. Um, I know that Claire felt that I had a strong feeling I wasn't the sort of husband she needed and wanted. And I found it very hard to understand her when things were difficult. But in the end, I think by God's grace, we were able to make a sacrifice of our own desires and needs in order to remain faithful to our vows and to our children. It was very hard for her, I think, because of the person she was, she had a tougher life emotionally than I did. And I honor her for deciding to just to stick with me, and I thank God for giving her the grace. Anyway, so then our children left home, early 2000s, and we had about 20 years of much greater closeness and friendship, even though, being the people we were, there were the occasional storms. So anyway, that was the low bit. Let me go back a bit. Let me backtrack a bit because I want to talk about the fact that all through my life, the Catholic Church, or in reality, Jesus himself, I'd say, was sort of knocking at my door without my understanding what was happening. And I've mentioned the early encounter with Tolkien, which gave me a sort of a view of the world which saved me, I think, from cynicism, from worldliness. I didn't know about his strong Catholic faith at the time, well, only learned about that later. But his writings are so pervaded with a Catholic imagination that I'm sure they influenced me. And I've talked about G.K. Chesterton, and I've talked about C.S. Lewis, who, of course, was not a Catholic, but a very good advocate for Catholic truth, I have to say. Um, in 1968, it's quite amusing in a way. My sister actually married a Roman Catholic, despite her own antipathy to organized religion and despite my mother's prejudices. I didn't really know my brother-in-law's spiritual life at all, but I'd like to think that maybe I benefited from his prayers. And he was a great guy. He was considering he was just the one Christian in his family, his children never really took to it. He was, he was quite a hero. Um, and I guess by about the 1980s, I began to encounter quite a lot of other little nudges of this kind. One time, when I was feeling quite depressed, I came across this wonderful concept of the sacrament of the present moment, Jean-Pierre de Caussade. I didn't really read the book. I just came across the idea, and it just seemed incredibly uplifting to um, I think when you're depressed, everything impresses on you, and what you need to do, you need to just be in the moment. And the idea that the moment is coming to you from God, and you can just accept that moment, not think about all the other moments. It was really helpful. And then not long afterwards, I read a book by an Anglican Benedictine, Gregory Dix, and it was about early Christian worship it was called The Shape of the Liturgy. And this was a real revelation. It sort of swept away that Protestant myth that the early church had very plain, simple worship, no liturgy, no hierarchy, not at all. Um, and I even, uh, sorry, yeah, yeah, I began. I think I began really to begin to have a pretty, beginning to have a Catholic view of the Eucharist, the Anglican Eucharist. It was I made some notes in my diary one time where I thought I clearly was thinking that the you know the bread and wine were the body and blood of Christ, and how did I ever really take this seriously before? Um, and reading John's Gospel, I put surely this Gospel is sacramental. So I was sort of my outlook was changing, but it never occurred to me that I needed to submit myself to the authority of the church. It took 40 years. Another interesting occurrence was that on the 2nd of June 1982, and I know that because I have a diary, I was lying in bed with a very nasty stomach upset, and I had the radio on, and I was listening to Pope John Paul II's visit to Wales. And in my diary afterwards, I wrote, I began to recover very suddenly while listening to the Pope's address to young people at Ninian Park, Cardiff. Recovery seemed to coincide with a rush of joy in the Lord at this marvelous meeting. Pope JP's address was about prayer. What a sensible thing to impress on the young of his church. And the main point was really that prayer is the key to everything in the Christian life. There was only one sentence that would have offended an evangelical teacher. There was one mention of Mary, but the stress was much more on Jesus. He refers to himself as a servant of Jesus and of the church, what other Christian leader would have such an impact? These are all my thoughts. The fact is, I put, there is some magic in the ordained priesthood. I mean, magic, I know it's a bit of a strange thing to put. And there's something special about the Pope. So it's probably a bit fanciful, but I do like to think that maybe hearing Pope St. John Paul it was actually the healing for my horrible stomach upset. Um, so when the dark period in our marriage came to an end, which was sort of like 2004 to 5, I went back to praying quite seriously, and Claire and I began to pray together regularly again, which we had stopped when we left that charismatic group. She began to use Book of Daily Prayers, and she became very attached to weekday Anglican Eucharist. And then in 2001, actually, it's a bit earlier than that, um, while I was in the midst of all these difficulties, I went to stay at the Burswood Healing Centre. Now, this was a place founded by Dorothy Kerrin, who'd been a high church Anglican in the first part of the 20th century. When she was young, she was miraculously restored to life by a vision of Christ, and she was given a ministry of healing, which she always exercised under obedience to an Anglican priest. And her beliefs were pretty Catholic. She had a deep devotion to Our Lady, who she claimed had appeared to her more than once. She also, not many people know this, she actually received the stigmata for a short time, but kept it private. And I found her very inspiring, and I felt after this visit, it was a very healing visit. I felt that I needed to, you know, I think I felt I needed to have my own version of faith. I must not just sort of try and copy other people. I think that's what I've been doing for a long time. And in 2006, I went back to Burswood with Claire and shared the experience with her. And while I was there, I came across a biography of Padre Pio, and that was really thrilling. I was really happy that there were still miracles. I was very impressed by his work as a confessor. Um, and of course, very awed by his bearing of the stigmata for 50 years. So I developed a devotion to him, even though, his background was so very different from mine, such a different kind of person. Um, I still didn't think I've got to become Catholic. But at this time, Claire and I became aware of an interesting that whenever Anglican clergy needed to offer you any sort of special spiritual practice or devotion, they always seemed to borrow it from the Catholic Church. Our church had regular talks on spiritual matters. In 2007, there was one on the Rosary. We were given beads and a booklet. So, having, already learned quite a bit from St. Pio, I actually began to say the Rosary from time to time. I had a spiritual director, an Anglican spiritual director, and he recommended that I go to the Jesuit Centre at St. Bino's in Wales. And I didn't actually get very far with Ignatian practices, but I found it quite helpful. And read more biographies of Padre Pio, got very keen on his saying his prayers. Another little nudge was that we had a very dear friend at our church whose girlfriend, who's now his wife, was Catholic. And the four of us started doing Lectio Divina together. And they used to go to Mass. So we went with them once or twice to the Dominican Priory of Blackfriars in Oxford. We went there for Ash Wednesday, sometimes for the ashing.
What
And
did you say? Could you say that one more time?
oh,
Dominican?
sorry,
Yeah.
yeah. We, the Ash Wednesday service. We sometimes went there for the imposition of ashes, just sort of because it was convenient. It was near work, and we liked the service. Um, and in fact, the Dominicans were invited to give a series of talks about their life and their particular form of religion at our church. So there were about 8 talks by them, and I was very impressed by them, I must say. Around 2016, I read a book by an American Tolkien scholar called Holly Ordway, and it was about her conversion, which is an interesting one because she was complete atheist, but she was converted first of all to evangelicalism by her fencing teacher. It's a great story, and but then she wrote a second edition, by which time she'd become a Catholic, and the book's called Not God's Type. So a great book. And I remember reading this and being quite inspired by it and thinking, well, I don't think Claire would like this book. I think she wouldn't like this book. I don't know why I thought that. Anyway, 3 or 4 years later, Claire did read the book and she found it really insightful. And I think it probably precipitated her towards Catholicism. In 2019, sadly, my Catholic brother-in-law died, and his funeral was held at Blackfriars, the Dominican priory in Oxford. It was attended by his almost completely non-religious family, but it was very sensitively conducted by Father Timothy Radcliffe, who used to be the head of the order. He's recently been made a cardinal. And this seemed to be almost like the end of an era. It left us as the only Catholics and as the only Christians, certainly not Catholics yet, in the family. And soon after this came COVID and lockdown. And by this time, and of course in lockdown, the churches were closed. By this time, Claire and I had actually left the parish church that we'd been to all those years. We tried another one. We found that rather unsatisfactory. There was the negatives were that we were being got down by the lack of serious sort of teaching from the pulpit. There really wasn't very much doctrinal or moral or social teaching. We were also got down by a lot of scandals and shenanigans, really, in the Church of England. What we were objecting to actually was more the sort of rather worldly and cynical spirit in which the church dealt with its problems. We were very troubled by the way that abuse had been covered up. Abuse survivors were being made to suffer a lot. And actually, we didn't have very strong views at this time about some of the big issues, homosexuality or, abortion, those things. We actually were not very, it wasn't that we were very, it was just that we weren't very strongly convinced one way or the other. We weren't, so it wasn't that impelled us into Catholicism, but what we just found the sort of unchristian spirit in which these things were being debated in our church. We also weren't very happy about the church not. I think we felt it was quite politically dominated, actually, and quite what's the word? Bureaucratic rather than spiritual. And at this time, we made a new friend who is a Catholic with a very active faith, with whom we began to pray via Zoom for the nation, for the really hard situation we were all in at this time. And that was great. Anyway, we tried watching live stream services from the various local churches, Anglican churches, and we found them rather inadequate. On Palm Sunday 2020, we decided to watch the live streamed mass from the Dominicans at Blackfriars. We knew the place, we knew we liked it. And of course, being a community, they could still conduct a proper conventual mass with people, obviously not lay people, but with themselves there. So it was a bit unlike the poor Anglican clergy who tended to go on video with a loaf and a chalice on their office desk. And I have to say, we were instantly hooked. and we watched Mass every morning for the next 3.5 years. It was a sort of mainstay during the quite dark times of COVID. And Claire, I think, was especially impressed by the content, the teaching of the homilies. They're only 5 minutes, but they were, I don't want to draw unflattering parallels, but there was content which there wasn't in the sermons we've been listening to. Claire herself had actually been brought up quite Anglo-Catholic before her embracing of evangelicalism at university. So to experience Catholic worship was not very difficult for her. And in my case, it was kind of the dry wood waiting for the lighted match. I pretty much decided by this time that I did want to become Catholic, but I wouldn't go ahead unless Claire did. So neither of us influenced or persuaded the other. We just got there together. And we kind of said to each other, shall we talk to them? Shall we? Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. So we contacted Father Timothy at Blackfriars in September 2022, and pretty much the discernment turned into instruction pretty much straight away. This was all via Zoom, I have to say. Another of the friars, Friar Richard Finn, gave us instruction for a few months, and we were received into the church on the 2nd of February 2023. It was great. It was
Why the 2nd of February? Just so I
Yeah, the
how'd that come
reason for
about?
that was Candlemas. Father Richard was a little bit worried about Claire's health, which was giving some concern about this time. She had a very serious illness in 2018, and she'd recovered from that, but there were concerns. So he felt that he didn't want to wait till Easter. We didn't know that she only had 10 months to live. So 2023 was quite a difficult year health-wise. Claire and I had only really just begun to explore what it meant to live as Catholics. It was quite startling for me to be left in December of that year to undertake that venture on my own. Because we always talked about everything. We always shared everything about what we believed, argued about everything, debated everything. Anyway, I have to say the church was a great comfort in bereavement. It really was. It was a great support. So Claire's funeral mass was held at Blackfriars on 3rd of January 2024. And of course, for many weeks afterwards, I sat in that pew on my own, quite tearful. One of the things I began to realize, though, was my conversion was quite patronizing. I sort of wafted into the church rather as if I was doing her a favor. I was like, yeah, okay, you're good. I'll join. I didn't really sort of think I've been pretty negligent. It's a bit like a prodigal coming home after just sort of being aloof, 72 years or 58 if you go from the teenage conversion. Anyway, I began to discover all the wonders of being a Catholic. Discover the Blessed Mother looking out for us. But it was so sad not being able to discuss these things with Claire. As I say, we always discuss that matters of faith, and I just had to do it on my own. So it's been not quite 2 years. And I must say, we found in the church what we were looking for. We found, committed people, believers who are really committed, wanted to be a community. Even though, I mean, I don't do a lot of stuff where I go to church, but there's just a sense of belonging. It's difficult to describe. We found really sound teaching that accords with Scripture. And of course, we found that life-changing contact with the Lord.
Yes.
I mean, I've had so many kind of surprises, really, even since joining. I mean, it's so funny because so many of the things that were kind of the normal thing as an evangelical that I kind of went right off because of bad experiences, they're back. It's, the close relationship with Jesus, witnessing to one's faith, evangelism, having a distinctive community, even kind of charismatic gifts, you could say. These things all, they've all sort of reappeared but there's a difference. The difference is that the setting, it's the structure of authority coming down from the Lord through the church and through the sacraments. It kind of places these things in the right context and makes them work. Um, it's so it's similar but different in an amazing way. Um, I mean, I guess Catholicism is a both and religion, not an either or one. That's what's so brilliant. Um, okay, another surprise is how natural it feels. When I was a Protestant, I always felt really awkward and self-conscious about my faith. I used to feel I was play acting. I used to feel a kind of imposter syndrome. And I think it's because in the church, the things that you believe, they're guaranteed as factually and actually real. As a Protestant, I always felt you had to imagine everything that you believed in. You had to work out what you believed in. You had to study the scriptures and work it out for yourself. You didn't sort of feel that anything was guaranteed. It was in your head. I mean, for example, as a Protestant, you came to the cross or you came to Christ in your head. As a Catholic, you come to the Lord or he comes to you in the Eucharist. He's there. It's quite different. Um, okay, I could go on about these surprising things. Another thing that surprised me was how physical and bodily Catholic teaching is. It really affirms the body. Um, and I think this is something that would have changed our marriage a lot if we'd had time to explore it. I've also been surprised by the very charitable attitude of Catholics to non-Catholics, very different from attitudes in the Church of England, which varied from they're not Christians to, well, yeah, they're Christians despite everything. Uh, so why would anyone leave such a wonderful home? It really, it's really sad to think that there are Catholics who want to leave the church. I mean, have become aware of the divisions of opinion, which are sad, but um, I don't know. I mean, one other thing that's amazing is that I suppose, is discovering the Catholic scene in America through YouTube. I've been amazed by how lively it is. And I don't think we've got anything like it in Britain. Podcasts like your own one, um, people like Father Mike Schmitz, Bishop Barron, Scott Hahn, Peter Crave, Matt Fradd and his thing, Joe Heschmeyer, Jimmy Akin. They're all these people who you can just get on the web and listen to. So inspiring. That amazed me. I didn't know anything about that before I became Catholic, and it's really helpful. So yeah, here we are. And I don't know. I'm sorry, I've probably gone on much too long, but
No, as usual, I love it. You were able to weave that all together. You mentioned, after the passing of your wife, by the way, we'll be praying for her, for Claire. You can bet on that. You mentioned that the church was a good consolation, a good comfort. Was it just the idea of attending mass? Was it adoration? Was it everything? Were there specific things? I just wanted to maybe talk
yeah,
about
yeah,
that just for a second. What helped you so much?
mass, just being there. And I have to say, this will sound very strange, but I haven't actually yet gone to adoration.
Oh,
That's something I'm really longing to do. I just haven't done it. I know everybody talks about it, and I know it'll be great. Um, so I'm going to do it. And but no, I mean, I think just the Mass is so amazing, and I it's so funny because uh, as an Anglican, I often used to have to sort of drag myself to church, but I just found myself going to early Mass several times a week after a bit. Not, I didn't think I really ought to do this. It's a good thing to do. I just wanted to go. Got up, went, it was just so wonderful. Um, there were kind people. There are kind people in the congregation who said, who spoke to me and said, "Where's your wife?" And that was really helpful. I think people, they quietly pray for you, and it's wonderful. Um, the Dominicans were great. Um, Several of them have been really supportive. There was one particular friar who my wife used to go and see actually. He kindly undertook to be her confessor. And so I went, he said, "Would you like to see me?" And I've been to see him several times. That was really,
great.
really helpful. Um, but yeah, the Mass, Jesus is there. He
How
really
is yes, amen. How is the faith in England currently?
well, I I'm not very plugged into the scene, I have to say, but I get the feeling that it's not not flourishing as much as it might. Um, I don't really know. I know that sounds a funny thing to say, but
No, no, no,
haven't
no, that's
I
fine.
haven't paid a lot
You
of attention.
yeah, it's kind
Um,
of an odd thing. I mean, sometimes people will say, like in America, if I were to ask such a question, people would probably be able to answer it better to a locale. They're not going to be able to
yes.
address it on a national level. But I was just, I guess, inspired. Well, okay, it's for you to look at America and see that there's a lot of activity on YouTube and whatnot. Um, I hope that a lot of that is going to pop up in where you are and in other areas. It'd be a
It would be
beautiful
great.
thing. Now, what church, what parish do you go to in Oxford?
Well, you see, I still worship with the Dominicans, so I'm not really parish based.
Got it.
Um, and that could change. That there's a very flourishing parish, which I don't actually know which parish I live in. There are two parishes, but there's a very flourishing city centre parish called the Oratory, which I have attended occasionally. And yeah, so I think it's very well attended, and um, so that life in Oxford might not be very typical of the country. I think there's a lot of Catholics who are quite serious, um, and obviously there's a lot of having university here. There's a lot of very thoughtful people, and the Dominicans obviously are very much part of that. They represent a sort of maybe the only really powerful Christian strain in the university, I should say, actually.
I believe it. I believe it. Did you happen to see the episode with Josh? So Josh Yen out where you are? I thought I'd mention that. You two should connect. Another
Yeah,
two
that's what
two gents from
inspired me to get into.
the same area. That
Yes,
would
he's
be
quite a young
amazing.
guy, isn't he?
Yes,
Yeah,
intelligent young man.
yeah.
Absolutely.
No,
Yep.
I mean, I thought, well, if this guy, can talk to you, maybe I should do the same thing.
There you go. Oh, I love
Yeah.
it. I love it. Edmund, was there anything else that you wanted to mention? Actually, one more question, and then you can close us out. But my question is, after the 72 years, or however you think of it, 58 years,
Uh-huh.
Do you ever sit back in a pew or at home and fully appreciate every step? Do you, it seems like you have a ton of joy. So it feels like I don't sense regret in you. I feel like you're able to look at this as a thread. Is that true? How do you view it?
It's a good question, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I think the Lord is really gracious, and he was there all the time, even when I can have very bad images of him. So I think, yeah, I do look at all the steps. I have to be honest, my regrets are having been not a very good husband at times.
Sure.
And I do have to talk to the Lord about that a lot because, Claire was an absolutely wonderful person. But, clearly I didn't always appreciate her. So that's where there are regrets. But in terms of the spiritual journey, no, I think each step was exciting and valuable, even when it was sometimes painful.
I, your honesty is so amazing to me. So I appreciate that in this whole episode. Really appreciate it. Is there anything you want to add that we did not cover?
I no, I think I just say it's such a wonderful discovery that Catholicism is really it. I, I'm just hope that no one wants to. I don't want anyone to leave it. I encourage people to stay with it, even if they haven't, if they're not happy where they are, just to keep at it and not to leave because honestly, I mean, I don't, I outside the church, it's the safe. Let me put it like this. I think it's the safest place to be now. I think we're living in quite a dark world, and I would stick with the Lord in the church
Yes.
and not leave.
Well said. Well said. Edmund, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eddie. It's been great talking to you.
Yes. Well, God bless you. And everyone, please know that we are so appreciative of you. And please share this channel. And until next time, take care and God bless.